Evening. Welcome to House Groups. We are back in the Gospel of Luke as a church. We this week are covering a story of a synagogue leader named Jairus, whose 12-year-old daughter is dying. And so he runs off to see Jesus, and he desperately falls at Jesus' feet and begs Jesus to come heal his daughter. Jesus says, "Sure, I will." But on the way, a woman with chronic bleeding for 12 years, she comes up to Jesus, and Jesus stops and he starts ministering to her. And while she's doing that, word comes from Jairus' house that this 12-year-old girl has died. Except that's not really a problem for Jesus, and so he just goes and raises her from the dead. It's just a fascinating story. And one of the things that jumps out to me from the story is just how desperate these people are for Jesus. In fact, the Gospel of Mark, who Mark also tells the story, he tells us that this woman with the chronic bleeding, that she had tried everything for 12 years, and nothing has worked. But when she hears about Jesus, that she pushes through the crowd, and at great risk to her, she just gets to him anyway. A Jairus, who's this upstanding, important person in the community, he just runs, despite that he's doing this completely in public, and just desperately falls and bows at the feet of Jesus. Jesus for them is the answer, and they don't really care how desperate they look. They just know they need Jesus. And yet it's like, for us, how often do we try 3 or 4 or 10 other things before we go to Jesus? Often for some of us, he's our last option. I heard a story just a few days ago, actually. I read in a publication from a group in our denomination, and it was a story of a woman named Raina, who is from a country in Asia where the gospel's just first starting to reach. And it's a story that has only happened, it just happened a year or two ago. So Raina's children, all of them were incredibly sick, and she had exhausted all of her resources trying to figure it out, and some of her children were near death. And so she just had given up hope of curing her family. Doctors couldn't figure it out. The witch doctors had left her with just empty promises and penniless, and the gods that she was praying to, they weren't answering. And so one day she felt incredibly hopeless, and so she walked out into the woods, and she grabbed a noose, and she was preparing to hang herself. And as she was preparing the rope, she heard footsteps. And so she just kind of embarrassingly looks up, and she sees this man, and the man asks her, "Tell me, what brought you to this tree?" And so she begins to tell him her story of heartache. And when she finished telling her story, she said, "And what brought you to this tree?" And the corners of his mouth turned up in a smile, and he said, "Jesus brought me to this tree." He was a young church planter from Converge's The Timothy Initiative. And he begins to share with her just the gospel and the hope of Jesus. And this woman, she receives it with love and hope, and she accepts Christ into her life. She returns home. She tells her whole family of Jesus. All of her family members accept Christ. And even crazier, they pray, and Jesus heals her entire family. And they became the first known followers of Jesus of that particular people group. We believe that God can do the miraculous, but sometimes you see this like on the front lines of evangelism and missions. God is just reaching into groups. Sometimes God doesn't just do the miraculous, he just outright does the miraculous often in reaching people. And I think for people groups, often it takes until they hit the bottom to turn to Christ, right? To try something different. The same can be true for just the general American. And unfortunately, I think sometimes that's even true for the Christian. But my encouragement to you tonight is, don't wait until you're desperate. Right? Turn to Jesus. Whatever it is, even if it just feels small right now, turn to Jesus tonight and trust in him. Amen.